HYDS 1. Now in opposition, we have CUDS 1. Including government, we have EWA 4. And on the closing opposition, we have KU 2. In this very distinguished panel, we have from my left, KIDA, and Alright, before we start the debate. Oh, it's close. Okay, great. May I remind all the audience to turn your phone on silent or turn it off. And if you do leave, please leave in between speeches. Alright, on motion that this House will ban religious parties from participating in elections in newly democratized Arab nations, I call for the Prime Minister to speak to the audience.
Here, here.
There.
Here, here.
We know that when we're talking about the Arab nations, they do not have a stable democracy. They're in the initial stage where they're adopting and they're in terms of adopting an application of the term of democracy, especially when we see the Arab Spring, which is in the status quo. People are fighting for the democracy. However, there is no stable infrastructure or consolidated value of democracy that has been adopted both by citizens and by the government in terms of implication and also in the adoption. So in this kind of stage, in this kind of context, we see the problem in the opening government and want to prove why secularism has some of the benefits, and especially in this particular context, it should be promoted. And secondly, why in this particular context, the harm will be great, and the harm should be stopped in this stage of adopting democracy for the Arab nations. So let's firstly look at how religion may have bad influence in the initial stage of democracy, how secularism has some benefits, although it is a controversial issue whether it's a best or perfect system. First, I have three analyses in terms of how characterizing secularism. Firstly, about how there could be a minority religion. Although we acknowledge the fact that that they are Muslim-dominated countries, Muslim ideas in terms of religion, that there could be a minority religion that also needs to be respected, which is the very core idea of democracy, where minority also needs to be respected as well as majority. Secondly, about how secularism is better is in the initial state. Is that when there's a democratic value and religion value, and when people don't know where to turn on, and however, when the nation and when the state and the religion is separated, people are likely to follow the democratic system, because the reason is thirdly because there is a rule, there is a judicial system, there is a checks and balance system within the democracy that's going to deter them from making decisions on the idea of religion that could be going against the democracy. So what the opening government think is that we should turn onto democracy in this kind of cases, and these kind of benefits is especially better in the context where they're in initial stage of adopting democracy. We're not saying that in U.S. because Obama is Christian and he values Christian values, that he should not come up as a president. However, we think that there should be a radical action which we define as ban, not letting any candidates to come up from the parties that has based on their idea of religion as being candidate for president, that they should not be coming up as running for president. We have seen in Korea that when democratic idea was accepted but was not completely consolidated or had a stable system of implication. Although we did have democratic idea and system in terms of president election and elected Park Chung-hee, we still cannot. It's still debatable whether he was dictator or the president or was actual president that represents democratic country. And this is the exact harm that I want to talk about harm that could be brought, that brings to my second argument, how Arab nations, if you characterize them, they're Muslim-dominated countries where religion-based practice were taken right before the democratic ideas were lately accepted. So what they did was they literally translated Quran. It's really different from reading Bible and promoting Christian values within US because they literally translated Quran. What the harms were brought was the extreme interpretations from the extremists that led to suffering of the minorities and also the rights of women who are rights of women, for example, even in the extreme case leading to killing them or honor killings. These kind of terms were accepted in the name of religion. However, it's not anymore. We acknowledge that. However, we want to deter any kind of danger that could occur by making it remain and also making it have an opportunity of a person who could hold this idea to be a representative of the country when there is an unstable democracy that has not been taken stable within the nation. Therefore, we think that this is very problematic of how when women's rights are suffered, like we have seen before, that it goes right against the idea of democracy. We think that democracy holds about the idea of democracy, the values that it should uphold, and it does uphold when it's stable, goes right against the idea of the religion idea that we have just seen few decades ago. Yes, ma'am.
Just because you ban religious political parties doesn't mean these religious radicals will disappear off from society.
Of course not. That is why we need to take radical action in terms of taking initial action from banning them from becoming a leader. We cannot kill them. We cannot get rid of them, but we can deter them with this motion in this particular context, giving chance to even be a leader. And we think that it could also have an incentive for parties because parties are created with their interest in terms of representation and gaining power. But if they cannot have a candidate that could represent them in order to be a leader, it could give them a strong incentive for them for decreasing the power of these parties that, as an opening government, want to strongly discourage. So about the values that democracies should uphold, we all know this: individual rights, participation, not only the majority but also the minority. We think that we think that these kind of values can all be really hard to be held by the religious idea. That's why we want to promote secularism in this particular kind of context. So as an opening government, we have given you the context of the debate of how there is already a problem. And in order to, and as an initial stage in the process of through applying better democracy, or when the citizens, and especially when the citizens want it, and it's in the trend of how international society is also promoting it, this only deters the development in terms of democratization of these nations, but also opens up the loopholes in the system and opens up to the danger of extremist idea included within the presidential system, especially in the context of where there is unstable democracy. So in the end, we're very proud to propose of promoting democratic values, secular democratic values that has less danger, possibility of danger, and more chance of leading it to right kind of democracy that the opening government want to promote in our nations. Thank you.
Alright, I thank the speaker for his speech, and to open the case for CUDS 1, I call for the leader of opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we fundamentally believe that today's debate is regarding the people and the opinions of the people. And that's why side opposition is we clearly believe that the ideas coming from the government side are absolutely just absurd. They come up here and say that just because you create a religious political party, that party is automatically going to lead to extremists trying to take over the country, dictators trying to dictate your own country. We believe that we are not living in that kind of state. We do believe that these kind of emerging democracies are still democracies and they are still accountable by the people. Based on that, I'm going to do two things in today's speech. First of all, my first argument is going to talk to you about fundamentally on a principle basis upon why these parties are legitimate to begin with. And second of all, I'm going to talk to you especially on a political ground, why you have to bring it on the politics and you have to bring it out to open discussion that brings better development of that particular democracy. Before that, 3 points of rebuttal. First of all is regarding secularism. Second is regarding the dictatorship or whatever president that they want to talk about. And third of all, about the deterrence of development. First point of rebuttal regarding secularism. They came up here and said that secularism is a very fundamental good thing, but they never were able to contextualize and why it is particularly beneficial in a state such as American country. But second of all, we also believe that it is very impractical to separate religion from these kinds of political grounds, because fundamentally, although you might be able to separate it upon a political ground, you can't separate every single individual living within that country, which is the fuel of every single democracy. Because individuals cannot break their religions within their politics, and if they think that abortion is a murder that goes against my individual values, then these individuals have a right to be represented at the end of the day. We believe that secularism is not something that can occur. Second point of rebuttal regarding stable state and all this dictatorship. First of all, I have three responses. First of all, as our closing opposition and our opening is going to tell you, those kinds of extremists are still going to exist, Mr. Speaker. So fundamentally, you're not solving any kind of problem. You're actually making those extremists actually go to the deeper and the darkest of places within that Arab country, which doesn't necessarily bring any practicality. But second of all, we also believe that the characteristics of these individual newly emerging democracies are also going to think about the perceptions that the international society has. Mainly because these individual countries are based upon the help of other democratic nations, right? So obviously they're going to think about what kind of values are going to be implemented within the dictatorship, and these individuals obviously believe that they don't want to go for dictatorship. They're also going to be accountable for their actions. And third of all, we also believe that people are rational enough not to agree to like a bombing idea of trying to bomb 9/11 and the World Trade Center. Because fundamentally, we see it in a clear case example of Egypt right now. Although it is a Muslim-dominated state, the president was actually doing fundamental, like very secret pacts within all of these other countries. And because they were about to create a law that actually gets into dictatorship, the people were actually protesting against that Egyptian president. Checks and balances already exist within the status quo. That is just fundamentally not going to occur. Third point of rebuttal regarding deterrence of development. We don't understand why a political religious leader is going to deter the development of that country. First of all, they're fundamentally accountable by the people. But second of all, we also believe that it's not necessarily, obviously, as I've already said, it's going to accommodate the majority of the people, and the people have to agree that we are going to bomb 9/11, or we're going to prevent that deterrence to begin with. But second of all, we also believe that in the clear case of Afghanistan, even if a political leader was actually trying to bomb, the majority of the Afghanistan people don't necessarily agree to bombing another individual country. Checks and balances already exist. We believe that that case is fundamentally flawed. First point is regarding why those parties are legitimate on a principle ground, and I have three reasons why. First of all, because we fundamentally believe that these are democracies. These are accountable by the people, and the people want that party to begin with, right? Because democracy is all about engaging within the opinions of the people, and if Arab states and the majority of people are actually Arabic and Muslim, and they want their representation and their religious views to be implemented within politics, we believe that that kind of representation should actually be legitimized. But second of all, we don't necessarily think that it is the criteria upon when we actually ban a particular party, right? Because the only criteria in when we prevent parties from entering into politics is when that particular, I'll take you in a moment, when that party is actually actively seeking out to harm individuals, such as the example of far-right, extremist-right parties. Those are the only indications in which we can actually ban a particular party. But even in those instances, those are cases that are very, very up to debate and that are very up to discussion. And only in the democratic grounds and only in the political grounds, those kinds of discussions can actually occur. Therefore, we believe that legitimacy actually increases. I'll take you in a minute. And my third reason about why it can actually be legitimized is because fundamentally we don't necessarily think that the government has a right to decide which kind of political value or which kind of religious background you actually are based upon. Because the main core idea regarding religious opinions and religious ideas is that it is based upon your environment, the kind of ideas that you were born upon. And if you were born into a particular religion, and if religion is your life, and that decides upon what kind of actions you take in the future, we don't necessarily think that it is the government's best idea to prevent these kinds of political parties from emerging, because fundamentally we believe that those are the opinions of the people, and you cannot dictate those kinds of ideas, and that's why these parties are legitimate to begin with. Before I go on, any points? Yes, closing.
according to your logic, you're talking about how far-right parties are ruled out of the status quo because they're extremists. But according to your logic, they're going to exist anyway, so what is your answer to that question?
Mr. Speaker, we believe that it should be actually debated upon the political grounds, and it should be open to open discussion. And that's basically what I've been talking about for the past 5 minutes. Right? Obviously, adjudicators, you know what I've been talking about. So let's go into my second idea regarding why it should be particularly politics. And I have 2 reasons why. First of all, because fundamentally the idea of any democratic nation is to talk about more discourse. It is about to talk about more discussion. And the reason why checks and balances exist within a political sphere is because it is accountable to every single individual living within that country. Everyone is going to actually see what kind of politics, what kind of values, what kind of religious ideas are based upon that policies and based upon that party. And because it is accountable by the people, and if it does not get approval by the people living in that society, we believe that that kind of discourse is actually a fundamental thing. Because the people are able to critique those ideas, the people actually have the capacity to critique and make sure that that individual party actually creates better ideas and better politics. It is their burden to prove why people are going to be stupid enough to actually agree with the policy that is going to bomb 9/11 or the World Trade Center. We believe that substantial harm does not exist upon their model. But second of all, they want to talk about minority religions, so let's engage upon that, which is the second reason. Because fundamentally, we do agree to the fact that minority religions do exist within these Muslim countries, but we believe that the political ground is the best way to represent your idea, to represent your fundamental opinion. Why is that? Because only in the political sphere do you have legitimacy, you have a mandate to actually give out your opinion to begin with. So fundamentally, that's also beneficial. But second of all, it is the best place in which you can expose your ideas, because obviously there's going to be media coverage. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of people interested in that minority religion, which is the best place to actually, not necessarily propagate, but actually show your opinion to the entire country. And that's why it's a fundamental benefit. But under their model, if you ban these political parties to actually come out into the open, you're pushing these minority religions into the deepest and the darkest corners, which actually discriminates them and makes them into a fundamentally harmful state. We believe that representation will not occur under that model, which is the best reason why we actually oppose today's motion.
Right, I thank the speaker for his fine speech, and to continue the case for HYDS 1, I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of Opposition speech was really good. It's just that it would have been really good in the context of a well-stabilized, liberal, democratic country. Initially, initially democratizing Arab nations, their whole case about how minorities' religion should be respected and how there would be checks and balances, how people would fear what other people think, that doesn't stand in this context, Mr. Speaker. That only applies in a well-stabilized liberal democracy, like in a debate where the United States should officially allow Christian groups or Muslims groups to participate in elections. That is the context where they're debating. Please engage with us, the second speaker. Now, before moving on to the 2 things that I mainly want to talk about, the first is how the religious parties are very different from religious individuals. And on my second point of the judicial system, let me just first rebut to what the previous speaker has said. Okay, so what the previous speaker is saying is that, in the initial stage of democracy, people are still accountable and that we should trust these people. But the thing is, Mr. Speaker, even in well-stabilized democracies, like even in Germany, there still are discourse of whether allowing these Christian groups, this Christian political party to actually participate in elections and whatnot. This is the context that we're still debating on. Even in liberal democratic countries, there still is discourse and there still is controversy about allowing religious groups to actually participate in this. And that is why, especially in this initially stable, initial democracies, those kind of Arab nations, it is most important to not allow these religious groups and ban them from actually coming into elections and harming that countries to further democratize and to further consolidate their democracies, Mr. Speaker. And for their second point, for their arguments about how secularism should be beneficial and that it's impractical to separate religion and your life. Of course it is. Like, I'm a devoted Christian. I can't really separate who I am when I'm like working. But the thing is, there's, as I will explain in my arguments, there's a difference between coming up as a religious party and me just being like a religious person, right? So in this case, we think that's very different. And what we fear is an official movement, like an official action that's been taken by these religious groups in participating in democracy, Mr. Speaker. My third point of rebuttal is how they say like extremists will still exist. That was a POI, right? But we think this whole argument, but they will still exist. It's a strong enough argument to say that we should not ban, because of course in any kind of cases there will still be people who exist. There will still be extremists. There will still be extreme rightists and whatnot. But still, this is not the reason to say that we should not ban. This is more of a reason that we should actually ban, so we can deter these people from coming into power, Mr. Speaker. Okay. So for their first rebuttal to their first argument of how people want that party, what we question is their whole premise that actually people want that party, Mr. Speaker. Because considering this as an Arab nation where they're now starting to have elections, where they're now understanding this notion of picking their own representatives, picking their own leaders, we think there could be many ways of abuse, many ways of manipulation done by the governments and done by the people who are in power, Mr. Speaker, through the manipulation of media or through the manipulation of ballots or whatnot. There can be many ways that these groups can actually manipulate the votes and manipulate the process of democracy. And in this case, we question their idea of how people actually want that party, Mr. Speaker. Okay, so to move on to my to move on to the two substantives that I have is, first of all, differentiating the religious parties and religious individuals, Mr. Speaker. I think it's pretty clear that once a religious party comes into election, then that party in itself has an identity, has a clear goal, has a clear incentive, or has a clear intention. That is related to religion, right? They're not pure parties that actually hold certain political views about conservative or about liberals. They have this idea of religion incorporated in their goals and in their agendas that they want to pursue, Mr. Speaker. And in this case, we think it is wrong for democracies, especially when they're initial democracies, for this idea to actually happen. And in the case of how they keep on saying, in the Muslim countries, there are religious people, whatnot. We have told you in our PM speech that it is very different to have an individual who's a religious person and that person or any person coming as under the name of religious group, Mr. Speaker. That is why we don't ban Obama, we don't ban Romney, we don't ban Nixon, whatever, those kind of religious presidents from coming into elections. It's just that we ban them once they form a religious group and have a clear agenda of pursuing their own religions or actually influencing some sort of democracy in the country, Mr. Speaker. I want to move on to the second point about this judicial system, Mr. Speaker. What we have to understand is in a democracy that is initially stabilizing, or in a country that is adopting democracy, what also happens is making of law, Mr. Speaker, the making of judicial system. Making of a judicial system. So what the government has to do is, with their cabinet members or with the parliament, they make law, they initiate law, and they try to apply that law, Mr. Speaker. And in the case where now, in Egypt, where they don't have a real constitution right now, especially in this kind of cases where they were trying to make the constitution, trying to make their articles, trying to make the laws of their country, we don't think any of the religious ideas or those values should in any way influence the making, influence in any way of the judicial system, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because when it is a Muslim religion, when it's Islamic idea, it's Islamic views, how they undervalue women, how they literally interpret Quran, we think there is a fear, and we fear the influence of those Islamic religious Muslim views influencing Quran.
Okay, if you can see that people cannot actually separate their religious values from their real life, how are those individual lawmakers going to differentiate their religious values with the constitutional laws?
In a democracy, it is not one person who makes law, Mr. Speaker. There are so many different types of people and so many different groups who actually make law. As I have said, governments and cabinet members and parliaments and the lawyers and judges, whatnot, they all come together and they make law. What we fear is having a religious party that dominates the government, the religious party that was elected by the people through manipulation or whatnot. Those people coming to power and those people making law, which will be very difficult to go back once that law is set, Mr. Speaker. That is why we see in the US, when the Constitution is made, it's very very difficult to actually amend that constitution. It is very difficult to go back and like change the laws, Mr. Speaker, because that was what was initially said when US was democratized in the first place, Mr. Speaker. And that is why what we fear is religious groups, especially these Muslim groups, with their ideas, with their values of undervaluing humans, undervaluing women's rights, and undervaluing like women's like equal rights and equal freedom to every single individual person. We fear that, and also on top of that, what we fear also is like minority groups, like minority religions, having like being suppressed or oppressed even more because like dominant majority religious groups being elected in the first place. So for them, not just dominant religious groups, but now the judicial system backs those majority religious groups and suppresses those minority religions. Very proud to propose.
Right, I thank the speaker for a fine speech, and to continue the case of opposition, I call
Mr. Speaker, I'll divide my rebuttals into two parts. Firstly, the part that actually is contentious, and secondly, the part that doesn't actually sound logically valid in the first hand. There's a logical read that can't be appreciated by a conscious, educated individual. I'll tell you why. Like, in the first part, they actually talked about how these people can actually manipulate elections. Well, 2 points of responses. Firstly, in that case, even non-religious people would not actually do this and would not actually be able to have a healthier democracy if you can stuff the ballot boxes with something that you don't want, and if you can actually rig elections. There's actually no potential possibility of these democracies from even being established in the first place. And there's this potential distinction between the types of parties you want and the types of democracies and how strong that democracy is. If it's not ready, there shouldn't be a democracy at all, and that's the stance of our side. And secondly, there is a lot of influence from Silvio Berlusconi in terms of Italian politics, and has a lot of influence, but that doesn't mean that the state has a right to actually restrict this individual from coming out as a political member of a political party. Just because you have a lot of influence on something that you call a democracy doesn't mean you should do it. And the third and the second part about how these parties are worse off than individuals, since like there is an official symbol of this matter. Well, firstly, symbolic manifestations of religion actually exist in the Vatican, exist in the mosque, and they often express political opinions throughout in the public, which often has a lot of media coverage if you are a majority religion. I don't think there was a distinction between the political parties and from these giant organizations and this institutionalized religious capacities that actually don't get media exposure, and we need a lot of distinction in this case. And there was also this idea of like Muslim domination in the first speaker. 2 points of responses. Firstly, banning religious parties does not actually ban these policies from being engendered. Since you actually explicitly conceded to our case, saying you can't actually dissociate religion from your political ideologies since they are newly emerging democracies. In that case, if the society is so biased towards women due to religion, these policies will be engendered no matter what. And the religious political parties isn't the issue in today's debate. And on the second level, diminish religious parties actually means that you diminish minority religions from actually going out in the public. What is the problem that arises from them? Oftentimes these Arabic countries are comprised of many different spheres of religion and many different spectrums of religion that often don't have a voice out in the public. And if you don't allow these people to actually come out, where you actually can separate religion from politics, these minorities actually suffer due to a consequence, since you actually don't let them out in the open for a public discussion. There's nothing on your side that does better than that. And there's also this notion about like secularism being better. Well, you could not actually prove that people can dissociate religion from politics in such religious areas. And these people are going to cluster together and express their public opinions. And if there are a lot of people that actually express a certain thought, there is going to be politicians that want votes from these groups of people and will engender policies that are actually going for these individuals in the first hand. And this notion regarding judicial system issue is logically invalid, Mr. Speaker. Well, first off, there was a Western influence from like these established democracies, so they will have to actually look out for such influence when they actually engender the system. And if you rig the constitutions to the extent that you actively oppress certain minorities, they will not allow these instances from occurring. And secondly, if lawmakers are also people, and if they can't dissociate religion from public spheres, then these lawmakers are obviously going to engender constitutions under your logic, the ones that actually get biased towards these people. And the only distinction that they gave was there are a lot of people that that make laws. Well, good. Then you have a lot of people that suck. Then you have a lot of people that actually can't differentiate from these matters. I don't think the number of people actually matters in today's debate.
Sure.
You have a number of stupid people making the laws under your case, and you're not helping your case in any way. I'm going to present to you a new constructive material, Mr. Speaker, with regards to why overly religiously biased policies would not occur even in these initial democracies because of the natural checks and balances that exist in these characteristics.
When religious idea is prominent and consolidated in that country, how do you ever overcome and evolve to be a more stable democracy?
That was your characterization. The idea that you can't actually dissociate religion from political sphere. That's the burden that you had to prove, in the response that you have to engender by these religious policies and religious parties engendering these policies. And I don't think that is our burden. The new characterization from me, with regards to why overly religious biased policies would not occur in these countries. This will be divided into two parts. Well, firstly, I'm going to talk about why there are a wide array of religions, and these religious parties that get elected can't actually ignore the minority religions in the first hand. And secondly, I'm going to talk about why there are a wide spectrum of believers as well, and why those radicalized people would not actually be the ones influencing the policies that are being engendered in these areas. Well, firstly, with regards to why there are a lot of religions in the first place. Well, it is a majority rule, obviously. There is going to be limited seats in the parliament, and there is going to be a lot of influence from atheists, from other religious minorities, and other people that actually take the seats in the parliament. Well, obviously, if you have 65% Muslims, 20% Hindus, and 10% Christians and 5% atheists, these people will comprise the populations if they don't like these religious parties to take the seats in the parliament. And these minority influence cannot be ignored, since they have an initial stage of democracy, and they have gone through a political turmoil in the first hand. And this turmoil is likely to occur if you don't actually allow these people to actually come forward to give their opinions in the parliament in the first hand. Therefore, these lawmakers would not actually engender policies based upon the ignorance of these minority parties. And second part, with regards to wide spectrum of believers. Well, if you look at the types of believers, Mr. Speaker, I don't think there are these people, these radical believers that only care about giving your life to Allah or whatnot. There are moderate believers that care about the stability of the society. And if you actually concede that these people exist, the portion of radical and most moderate people would actually want social stability over religious ideals. And they have just gone through the political turmoil of destroying that stability, and they want a stable nation of a stable democracy. And they would not actually want radical policies that actually cause an uprising from these minority religions in the first hand. And these moderate believers that believe in the majority religions will not actually want these lawmakers to engender policies based upon the radical thoughts, since it is likely to lead to a political turmoil that's likely to dismantle this democracy that they have established. And if this is true, leaders would not want what people would not want, and will not have the policies that overly bias their religions in the first hand. And because of these reasons, we are extremely proud to oppose.
Right. I thank the speaker for his speech, and to extend the case for you, I call upon him.
Mr. Speaker, in my speech, in the closing government, we're going to go back to principles, why the principle of democracy should not be associated with the idea of a religion, especially in the context of newly democratized nations, why this leads to further harm to the international society, why it discourages
why it discourages other democratization in other states that is currently going on. But further on, I'm going to basically be talking about, the principles of democracy as a whole. Now, what opening government did not really do was, associating again concept of democracy, how it fails in this context, right? But we're also going to extend on the international relations and how this affects other nations as a whole, how it actually intensifies the conflict that is going on in the Middle East. But before going on to our contribution, several steps of development regarding their case. Now they first come up and talk about, how these radical people that the opening government was talking about is going to exist anyway. Therefore, we give them room to debate upon, like in a political sphere. But first of all, even in the status quo, we do not give them power, right? If they have these kinds of radical stances, instead of giving them power, we regulate them with law. We regulate them with secularism, where actually we have we to treat these individuals who are getting up equally. So we rule them up. That is exactly why they were talking about, how these far-right wing parties also be ruled out from the very society. But Seung-Hwan also comes up and talks about how, there will be a lot of turmoil if this is not brought into the political sphere in the very first place. But we clearly suggest to the harms that, there will be more turmoil, there will be more internal conflicts when this policy is not initiated, right? Because we actually think that the individuals within these nations like Egypt or Syria who initiated changes and not necessarily the religious individuals, right? We actually think that the biggest group who actually initiated these changes are actually liberalists who are influenced by the democratic values in these very nations. And these individuals do not agree with some of the religious values that these kinds of big political parties such as Muslim Brotherhood suggest. So we also think that in that kind of a context, Mr. Speaker, these kinds of individuals who do not agree with these kinds of religious parties, they are going to cause turmoil again. Therefore, we think that in that kind of a case, turmoil never disappears under their policy at the same time. Going on to the third level of response regarding Taeyeong's biggest idea of how religion, especially in this kind of context, has to be debated upon a political sphere. Why we actually defend minority religions. Three steps of responses regarding that. First, we think that usually in this country there is a dominant religion called Muslim, even whether they are Shia or these kind of religions. We think that parties like Muslim Brotherhood or Salafists, we actually think that these kind of a single religious party overrules other minority parties. So we think that in this kind of a case, the concept of accountability that they are talking about, we think that this does not happen in this kind of political sphere from the very beginning. But we also think that minority religious parties cannot be established from very beginning, Mr. Speaker, because in order for a political party to form and gain seats in the parliament from the very first place, we need support from the people. But because the majority of people in the nation do not stand for these kinds of minority religions, we think that there will be a power imbalance going on in this parliament, which we do not want to achieve in today's society, Mr. Speaker. Going to the third level, because we think the characteristic of a religion itself is very exclusive because you only believe in one God and you rule out all of the other principles designed by other religions or other values. We actually think that this kind of